Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. In an extraordinary letter to his senior leaders, the commanding officer of the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt, Captain Brett Crozier, asked that his ship be evacuated as coronavirus has spread across his crew of more than 4,000. He said that given the extraordinary circumstances that we are in peacetime and the danger to his crew, he'd like to land everyone and put them in quarantine ashore in Guam rather than risk lives by having everybody cooped up aboard the ship. While aircraft carriers are massive, anybody who's ever been on those ships, especially at sea, knows that social distancing just doesn't really work given the proximity in which people work and live. Last week, we spoke to Acting Navy Secretary Tom Modly when there were 3 reported cases on the ship. Within days, 100 were diagnosed, and Navy leaders sent the ship to anchor off Guam. The Macon Island Amphibious Ready Group, with 2,000 sailors and Marines, has been asked to steam off of San Diego rather than return to port. The San Francisco Chronicle disclosed Crozier's letter, but the Navy has yet to formally respond. How leadership responds, however, could have major repercussions across the force. Joining us now to discuss the implications of the letter, how the Navy should respond, and what's at stake are 2 retired United States Navy commanders, Brian McGrath of the Ferry Bridge Group Consultancy, who commanded the guided missile destroyer USS Bulkley, and Chris Cervello of our team, who is a former Navy public affairs officer. Before we get started, a quick shout out to all of our sponsors. Our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and broader cyber coverage, and Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage, and of course, Bell sponsors this podcast. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you.
Thanks, Vago.
Brian, start us off. You commanded a warship. Anyone in uniform knows that executing the mission is paramount, especially aircraft carriers in the Pacific at a time of great power competition. How extraordinary is a letter like this coming from the commanding officer of an aircraft carrier on the front lines, and how should the Navy respond?
Well, I think it is an extraordinary letter. It is singular in its first of all, it's a superbly well written letter. I was very happy to see it was fact based. It proposed solutions, and it was exactly the kind of thing that you would want a subordinate to write. You wouldn't necessarily want the whole world reading it, which subsequently happened. But it is a very, very well done letter, and I think it is extraordinary because we are living in an extraordinary time, and I think the captain appropriately rang the alarm bell with this letter.
And I should say that, Brian, you continue to advise the Navy on matters of strategy. And Chris, I know that both of your phones have been ringing off the hook with folks contacting you with advice and to exchange views. Chris, give us your sense on how this is playing and how the Navy has to respond. And maybe you can start us there, and then we can get Brian's take on it as well.
Well, I think Brian was right when he said, we are living in extraordinary times. And I think that was obvious to most people in the Navy prior to this. But if it wasn't, the release of this letter and the bounce that it has received this morning has really driven home that point. I think the Navy is dealing with 2 specific issues, or maybe 3 specific issues. One is the practical approach to how it handles coronavirus across the force. And just like major cities and major organizations are having to deal with that problem, they have a problem that has now been well highlighted on board USS Theodore Roosevelt, and what to do with a spreading virus and how they deal with those folks. And then I think there is a bit of I think it's a messaging challenge. I won't say it's a problem because that sounds pejorative, but I mean, how do they convey to sailors? How do they convey to leadership? And how do they convey to those interested in the American public that they have their arms around this problem? And I think of those 3, that last one may be the most difficult, and maybe the one that they need to try to solve the soonest.
And we should say that just before we taped, acting Navy Secretary Tom Modly was on TV trying to reassure the American public about the incident. Brian, your take on how the Navy should be responding to this to get that balance right of caring for sailors while at the same time remaining operationally minded?
Just a day or so ago, we saw a really symbolic sailing when the hospital ships were in the news entering New York and Los Angeles. Quite frankly, those ships they're wonderful pieces of gear, but there are plenty of empty gymnasiums and plenty of empty dormitories in prep schools and colleges around where fine temporary hospitals could be set up. Those ships sailing were a symbolic message, and I think not only symbolic in that they can and will provide some relief to the non-COVID medical problems in the areas that they are deployed to, but it was symbolic. The Navy needs to do something here that is more than just symbolic, but it is at least symbolic. It's got to act. It's got to get resources to this captain. The problem is, though, he may not be the last captain with this issue. You mentioned another strike group that is laying to, waiting for further help. We don't know how bad this is going to get. Acting Secretary Modly has been out in front of this problem from the beginning. I think he's done a very good job communicating both the dangers associated with the virus and the scope that the Navy's response has been. So, Gilday has also been in front of this problem. They need to get out. They need to stay out in front of this. They need to make sure that sailors know that their best interests are at heart. And quite frankly, the rest of us have to also remember that aircraft carrier is full of people who are not in the most at-risk demographics. It's the one saving grace we have here. Yes, there are 4,000 people stacked on top of each other, but they are in largely demographic categories that are of the lowest morbidity. We need to get them off the ship, most of them. Some of them have to stay and for security and engineering purposes. We have to get most of them off the ship. We have to get them into quarantine conditions. Open bay gyms are probably not the best answer. Some sort of actual isolation rooms is the way to go. And I think the Navy can go a long way with very public actions to help this ship.
The question is, and of course, the captain in his note made that clear, right, that a couple of hundred people would remain on the ship in order to tend to the reactors as well as security, and then also sanitize the ship as best as possible, so that once everybody goes through that incubation period, once everybody goes through a quarantine period, could get back aboard the ship and get back underway at the end of the day. There is a lot of criticism of leadership across the board for not having responded to this crisis earlier, not having acted early enough, whether it was surging on an acquisition of ventilators and masks and other devices. Many national leaders have been on the record of that, from the president to Pentagon officials as well, sort of all saying, hey, look, we're on standby for further guidance or for a greater demand signal. The CNO, Admiral Gilday, even mentioned in his press conference that there was a debate whether or not the ship should conduct a port call, or Roosevelt should have conducted a port call in Vietnam. The decision was made that the port call would be in the southern part of the country where there were no coronavirus cases. 15 days later, we did see cases start to pop up on the ship. At the end of the day, what are some of the lessons learned from this episode, given that we are in the beginning of, probably closer to the beginning of a crisis that's going to claim many, many lives rather than the end of a crisis, right? I mean, certainly, as you said, the military demographic is a much healthier demographic, fewer pre-existing conditions, much healthier, much younger group, but at the end of the day, also will impact them. What are some of the lessons learned? Cervello, you start us on.
Before I jump into the lessons learned, I would just say that I don't know how helpful it is to use hindsight and be overly critical, because I think the biggest lesson is that we we were not ready, and we had not thought about this problem in the way that it has presented itself. And I don't know that you can necessarily blame one or a set of individuals, at least not at this point, and I'm not sure that it's helpful, purely from a Navy standpoint. I was texting back and forth with a former colleague prior to coming on the pod, and that person had said, hey, it's normally when the world is in flames that our thinking is the sharpest, that we normally rise to the occasion. And the person was lamenting that does not appear to be the case. I share that view, and I, from a lessons learned standpoint, I think it's because we just we had never allowed ourselves to consider this. And so therefore we were not prepared. And even when it became obvious that immediate action was needed, I think that we were unprepared to deal with the civilian leadership that was in a different place. And by we, I mean the uniform side. I think the uniform side was in a different place. At least that's what's been relayed to me. The fear of getting out in front of particularly the White House and sounding alarm bells earlier than the White House was willing to sound them, I think put us in a position where we've been playing catch up ever since. The longer term lesson, I think, is going to be that you have to think through these types of things, and you won't be able to think through everything, but I think we need to allow our thinking to expand. And I think that we need to figure out, okay, when there is disagreement, we need to have a better sense of when we ring the alarm bell sooner so that we don't find ourselves in peril. Before I turn it over to Brian, I mean, whether it's at boot camp or at the Naval Academy or ROTC or whatever, I mean, we talk about this type of leadership, and we talk about making these types of hard decisions. I think in this case, we need to figure out why, if we knew what the right answer was, why we didn't sound that bell earlier.
Brian?
Well, I think one thing that we ought to learn the lesson of is that math is hard. Exponential growth is different than linear growth. And when you're dealing with exponents, things, the time to act is early, because the more you wait, the more math becomes the driving force. And we're seeing that in the it took a certain amount of days to get to 1,000 deaths in the United States, and then it took 2 days to get to 2,000 deaths. So number one, math is hard. Pay attention to your exponents. Act early. There were lots of people ready to lean forward on this, and I know what Chris is saying when he talks about we're not being prepared, not being ready, that sort of thing. But there have been pandemic war games and simulations, and I mean, this stuff goes on. This is the sort of jot and tittle of interagency and government response. Had an enlightened group of political leaders been leaning into this and said, do what you know is right, get going now, at an earlier date, we would find ourselves in a better situation than we're in now. We did not have that team. We did not have those decisions. We did not have those people. So we are where we are. I don't know how bad this is eventually going to get in the fleet. I do know that if I were captain of a destroyer right now, I would be trying to read everything I could. I would be talking to my crew all the time. I would be making sure that we, to the extent possible, we're able to socially distance even within the skin of the ship, although you cannot really do that, especially in berthing areas. For instance, the mess decks would be open much longer than they are now so that you could have fewer people eating at a time. There are certain things that you can do, but and we would have fewer people sleeping. And we would probably be not doing all the things that we do, so that you could have people off around areas of the ship where there just aren't people unmanned. There are lots of unmanned spaces on a ship. You could have people in those unmanned spaces, plenty of books on a ship, playing video games, doing it, whatever it is. But I would be trying to space my crew out as best as I could. But I wouldn't want to be one of those guys right now. It isn't a place to be.
You win the award for best phrase of the podcast, by the way, with jot and tittle. Didn't see that one coming, Brian. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, to the point though of leadership, right? I mean, the question here is not a question of whether it's bad leadership, but a concern of toxic leadership about which nobody can do anything, right? I mean, when you are so concerned about your ultimate subordinates' actions or reactions that it forces you to change how you would communicate and then how you yourself would lead, right? I mean, there were people that if you talk to in early January, we're talking about the magnitude of the crisis in China that was unreported and what impact and implications it would have, not just on the military, but more broadly. And at the end of the day, the responses did not start in earnest coming until roughly about 2 weeks ago. How do you lead in an environment like that without mentioning any names? How possible is it to lead? And how do military leaders not end up discrediting themselves in the eyes of their subordinates by not responding as early as they could or should?
The bottom line for me, as a former leader, and as someone who has read and studied leadership, is that there is a moral and ethical component of leadership. Leadership and personal responsibility, doing what is right even when no one is looking. These are all the kinds of things that we expect from our leaders, and these are the traits that shine through in our best leaders. I look at. I want to take the captain of this ship has done something that people are far and wide evaluating as something that took great courage. And they took great courage because there is this sense that an organization like the Navy will not take this letter well and will react bureaucratically in negative ways. This is a great opportunity for Modly and CNO to not meet those expectations, to lead from a place of moral and ethical rectitude, and to say, we're going to meet you where you are, Captain. We're going to provide you what you need, and we're going to do it because it's the right thing. There's no harm, no foul here. That we don't care about the Navy's long-term reputation here. That's not what we care about. We care about you. We care about your crew. We care about doing the right thing. And as long as the CNO and the Secretary keep saying those things and making sure their subordinates at the 4, 3, 2, 1-star level act accordingly, the Navy will get through this, and the Navy will learn some good lessons for the next time this swan, white or black, swims through our pond.
I agree completely at the Navy level. And I fully expect, knowing what I know of Secretary Modly and of Admiral Gilday, I would expect that their reaction, they may be frustrated that it has come to this, but I think their reaction will be exactly as Brian has described. I think the larger challenge has been and remains with the senior leadership at the Department of Defense, particularly the senior uniform leadership. Brian mentioned, the words moral and ethical and doing what is right. And I absolutely believe that those 3 and 4 stars that are at the center of power and authority at the Pentagon, I believe them to be moral and ethical men and women. I think the concern for them is when and how do they push back in a way that is beneficial and effective to those people that they lead. There is this idea that at some point an admiral or a general should throw his or her stars on the table if they disagree with leadership. And my personal experience working on a number of staffs is that is seldom ever considered as a viable option, mostly because the men and women in command don't want to leave their subordinates and don't want to take, in their mind, the easy way out by throwing their stars on the table. So I think that what you'll see is those 3 and 4 stars continue to try very hard to use and pull whatever levers they can and go along and get along with whatever they have to from the Office of the Secretary of Defense and from the White House, and they will do whatever they can to make it work in this situation. Long term, is that the right thing for the institution or for the military? I don't know. But I think that that's the way the services are built, and that's fully how I expect them to react.
If the nation is as short of ventilators and masks and gowns, and that DoD is shipping its excess inventory of roughly around 2,000 ventilators to state and local governments that are also in dire need, right, with genuinely unstable patients where this equipment's going to be necessary, how much flexibility does the Navy have when 4,000 people are landed in Guam? Do we have enough gear at this point to support the folks that we do put on the beach?
I am not in a position to answer that question because I don't know how much gear we have and I don't know what the need is. I do know that if I were the CNO or the Secretary of the Navy, I would say our priority is to ensure that our Navy and our Marine Corps have what we need to treat our outbreak. And if we are ordered to sacrifice some of that gear and send it elsewhere, then we would do that. But at this point, we really need to hunker down and take care of the problem that we can take care of.
Let me ask two questions, Brian. You were supposed to come on for our virtual sort of Navy League coverage, or Navy League Week coverage, or what would have been Navy League coverage next week to talk about 355 ships and where we stand on that. But let me ask a great power competition question of you both. The focus of great power competition, there's a tendency of thinking about it in terms of hardware, in terms of ships, 355 or 4 something with unmanned, or 386 fighter squadrons, or 50 brigades or brigade equivalents, or what have you. But the United States' ability and its profile and history as a great power has been to influence across economic, diplomatic, as well as on play cultural levers. And generally, when there's a crisis like this, the United States is in the forefront. And we're the ones who have a tendency of helping our allies. Whereas there are allies now, including, for example, Italy, who feel the sting of not having been helped and actually are insulted when the Secretary of State admonishes a country that's losing 1,000 people a day for not sending the data that the United States needs. And there's this sense that China is actually playing this better. And in fact, an Italian official noted, as Bob Work, the former Deputy Defense Secretary, told us yesterday, that the era of American leadership may be past, and that the era of Chinese leadership may be there, because China responded and Russia responded to Italy, and its allies didn't. How important is the deployment of a carrier or a destroyer, or are those relatively irrelevant compared to some of the broader actions we're taking that actually are the things that characterize the United States as a great power? The power that's always there to help and lead the world, as opposed in this case where we seem to be responding to everything, and perhaps, dare I say, not as well as we should have, or with the kind of preparation that people expect of us.
I have thus far in this podcast been sitting on my hands, with metaphorically, with respect to criticizing the administration, only because anybody who reads my social media profile and writing elsewhere knows that I am a very, very harsh critic of this administration. This, however, I just can't not talk about it. The fact that we waited to respond, and that we did not take other countries who were knee deep in this, their dire straits, seriously, was an attempt to try and make this seem like it was not as bad as it is, for financial markets reasons, for electoral prospects reasons, you name it. None of them fall into the category of good, ethical, and moral leadership. That has been part of America's MO in the world for the post-World War II period, and it has been part of the way we approach the world. Yes, when we are doing humanitarian things, we are also gaining from it ourselves. Yes, the Marshall Plan created the world's largest market and helped us have an incredible sustained period of economic growth. The question, though, isn't, do these things have a secondary increase in American interests, the question to me is always, are we helping the people that we count on to be there when we need them? That's what we're not doing. That's what we didn't do. That's what we haven't really done during the course of this administration. And it has been a lot of, you're on your own, we got to take care of our own, America first. And that is what the world is hearing. That's what the world is seeing. And when the chips were down, that's what we did. We are that now, and it bothers me. And I hope that someday we're able to reestablish ourselves as the city on the hill that we like to think we were, or some of us like to think we were.
Chris?
It's hard to say it better than Brian just did. The only thing I would add is, objectively, if your approach is America first, right, and if you're willing to turn your back on friends and allies, and you're willing to cede the message or influence to the Chinese and the Russians, you better have your act together when you deal with things at home, right? So if your approach is make America great again, then you damn well better make America great again. And objectively, as I look at both the approach internationally and the approach domestically, the administration is 0 for 2 on coronavirus, and so it's hard to justify, right? I mean, the from a purely messaging standpoint, it is, hey, I'm willing to take some risk. I'm willing to sacrifice the 70 years of post-World War II prosperity and America's place in the world so that we get better at home. I think we've seen with the handling of this crisis that hasn't worked. So now what? I'm kind of like Brian. I'd like to go back to what has worked for 70 years and focus our attention there.
Brian, let me take you back to 355 ships. You have written and commented thoughtfully on that. Where do we stand, and what does it mean?
It means nothing. It's dead. It's dead in the water right now, at least for the foreseeable future. And by that, I mean in the next year, perhaps 2 years. The $2.2 trillion CARES package that the Hill passed recently, in my view, is probably less than half of what will eventually get spent to recover from this as yet unbounded epidemic. I think that we, as a country, are going to have to really defend how we spend our money. The fiscal models that we have right now are going to change. I saw somewhere this morning that one of the major investment banks was predicting something like a 30% annualized drop in GDP for the next quarter. That's gigantic. The country is grinding slowly to a halt. There's lots of good things happening, and we're all getting food, and some of us are getting toilet paper. But the bottom line is, it's nowhere near the productive power of the United States of America and the economy. And we're going to be in strange fiscal and monetary place for a year or so after we declare victory on this epidemic, this pandemic. And so I think we are more likely to see a 250 ship Navy 10 years from now than we are to see a 350 ship Navy. That is my prediction right now.
And obviously, right, $6 trillion, right? I mean, that's spending, and there's going to be a drop, obviously, in government revenue. So that's all
borrowed. I'm sorry. I think I probably said 2.2 billion, but it's 2.2 trillion is what. 2.2
trillion just for the latest stimulus effort, right? I mean, if you add up quantitative easing and everything else, and buying junk, which the Fed has said that it would do in order to be able to keep the economy going, I don't see how a defense impact is avoided as a consequence of this, and that's going to be the case around the globe as well. And I think that if anybody thinks, for example, that China is going to be able to maintain what it does at the end of this, especially given the economic impact that's likely to hit China with movement of supply chains and the like, everybody's going to feel this thing from this, and likely to feel it for longer than people think, as you said. One of the things that Mark Esper has been pushing and has sort of gone back and forth on this was whether or not to report corona cases or not. And now the guidance is to do it on a limited basis and not to report or to report overall numbers, but without specificity, and leave it to unit commanders to coordinate with local communities. And there are folks who are looking at that and saying, look, where do you guys fall on that? Because at first it was an operational security issue that was hauled out. And then there are folks who were like, no, that wasn't an OPSEC issue at all. It was more of a, hey, we just don't want to discuss the impact of this on the U.S. military. Where do you guys fall on the degree of openness we have to have and whether or not this is a legitimate OPSEC issue? Because I think, to be blunt, when units don't sail and stay at home, you know what I mean? I think the other guy has a capability to see what's out there and what's not at the end of the day. Brian, if you want to start us off, Chris, we can wrap up on that.
Yeah, I think in general, I want more openness. That is a general statement. When I get down to specifics, I look at what does it mean when an aircraft carrier is potentially tied to the pier because a percentage of its crew is down with the coronavirus. I feel like this is a newsworthy event, and that's why we're all talking about it. I think if the captain were held to the standards of the readiness reporting system, he would probably have to report decremented readiness in his personnel, in his crew. There would be certain skills that might be hit harder than others. But if it came down to the readiness to go to war, as the captain said in his letter, he's ready to go, and he would. And that's the way we have to keep talking. I would like to hope that aggregate level readiness does not become something that we're talking about in the open press.
Chris?
I've always been a bit of a pragmatist on OPSEC. This information is going to get out. This is a national, if not international level crisis still. And by not commenting on it, one, you are letting somebody else comment on it first. And two, you are not able to structure the conversation the way that you want it to go. So to me, it's a foolish decision on the part of leadership. It just sends the wrong message to the American people. I mean, our adversaries understand what this means for us in this case. So I don't think it's a good decision.
Hasn't the United States occasionally throughout its history, when issues like this have arisen, make it abundantly clear to adversaries, hey, if you want to really test this right now, you're making a strategic miscalculation. I mean, isn't that one way of sort of solving a little bit of this? If you guys think you can pull one over on us just because Roosevelt is sidelined or the Macon Island ARG is sidelined, you've got another thing coming. If you think you can get one over on us, you're going to be making the miscalculation of the century. I mean, wouldn't that kind of be a way to focus attention?
One hopes that level of deft statesmanship exists. One hopes that level of deft statesman exists. One is left to hope that these days.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Went a little bit longer with the conversation. Brian, you're always welcome back anytime. Always enjoy it. Chris, thank you for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. Check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman and our technology report sponsored by General Motors Defense. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight, bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.